All right, welcome everybody. Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us for another luncheon. On behalf of our board of directors, I want to thank you for being with us here today. And today, I also want to make sure that we point out and thank Ambassador Branstad for being here with us and Representative John Dunwell. I don't believe, there you are. I don't believe there are any other elected officials here, but if I'm missing anyone, I apologize. And having been looked over for introductions before, at least you'll know that I know what it feels like. We will start out the presentation by introducing our speaker, then Tom and I will ask some questions of him, and then Tom will close us out close to 1 o'clock so that you can all get on with the rest of your day. We're really pleased today and thrilled to have an encore performance from someone who was here with us 13 months ago, Uri Goldflam. Uri is an IDF veteran. He served as a combat platoon sergeant and paratrooper in the reserves for over 20 years. He's also a scholar. He has a BA in International Relations and Judaic Studies and a master's in Foreign Policy and Diplomacy from Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He's been a director of the International School at Reichman University and has had a leadership position in major Israeli NGOs. He's a licensed tour guide. He educates groups, including faith delegations, members of Congress, and senior executives. I had the pleasure of meeting Uri in 2016 when I took my first trip to Israel through AIPAC's American Israel Education Foundation, and I think several other people have here too. I think Matt Strawn, you were on one of Uri's trips, and several others in the Des Moines area have also been. And I was really struck by Uri's depth of passion and knowledge about Israel and Israeli culture, the history of the country, the history of the people, but also his knowledge about Christianity. He probably knows more about Christianity than any Christian in this room. Well, at least more than I do. I know that for a fact. And he's just a pleasure to be around. And I think you'll find what he has to share with us today very insightful. He's going to start out with about a 10-minute overview of the current situation, where things stand today, about 15 months after October 7th. And after that, Tom Henderson and I will ask some questions of Uri. And if there's time left over, we can open it to the audience. But I have a feeling we're probably going to have a lot of detail to try and cover within an hour. So let that be the extent of the introduction. And now please join me in welcoming Uri Goldflam.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for hosting me here again. 13 months ago, when I stood here and talked about the war, it was just a few weeks after the war began, after October 7th. I think we were all still in shock. But I don't think I could have imagined that 13, 14 months later, I'll be back here still talking about this war. What I'd like to do is kind of do a very, very quick, where are we now kind of summary. And try to give you a bit of an overview of where things are going. I have been updating this presentation literally this morning with all the different events and activities, so much so that I had to make a separate, I have another presentation that I have with me that we might go back and forth between them, just so we can understand a little bit more what's going on. So a year ago, when I pressed this button, it actually worked. Maybe if I stand up. Okay, I'll do standing. There we go. So when we talked about this a year ago, is this on? No. Yes, it's on. Okay. We talked about the Middle East. We talked about the changes in the Middle East. I talked about the tectonic shifts and the paradigm shift that occurred in Israel and in the region. And again, when Sinwar launched his attack 14 months ago, nobody could have imagined that just shortly a year later, he would be dead Hamas would be almost completely decapitated. Hezbollah would be destroyed and decimated, its entire leadership killed. Syria would have been also in an upheaval, Hezbollah in Syria destroyed, Iran losing all its assets on Israel's borders. It's truly astonishing what happened in the last year. And again, and much of these have happened just in the last week. So I want to go through this a little bit, remind you first of all about the size of Israel, but I want you to go ahead and remember that we're not just talking about today. Like, we need to kind of zoom out. And one of the things that Israelis are seeing also unfolding, it was very hard in the first days after October 7th. But the idea of the historical understanding, the historicity of this moment. And I think that is something that makes Israelis specifically, Jews in general, people that are so old and have traversed history for such a long time, to understand this level of historicity, to understand this monumentous event that's happening right now. And I think that's also part of the way Israelis find resilience in focusing on the larger picture and not just the day-to-day events. When we left Gaza in 2005 and we saw Hamas take over, we did not in the West truly understand the nature of the jihadi mentality. And this is something that I want to focus on because it's truly it's very hard to grasp. It's very hard to grasp for a Western ear that there is a jihadi mentality that aspires to death, that aspires to reach martyrdom through death and killing, including their own children. When we talk about the jihadi mentality, we are talking about an ideology that believes that life starts after death. That life begins only when you arrive at the bosom of Allah and you reunite with the Prophet in paradise. And the best way to do that is when you're innocent. Who are innocent among us? No, really, who's innocent? Children. And so when children die, they go straight to heaven. You just done them a favor. It's not that terrible. Now, this is a very hard concept for us to grasp. We've always learned, and in Western liberal understanding of the world, classic liberalism, people are the same. All people are the same. People want for their children what we want for our children. A safe, healthy, happy childhood, growing up to be useful members of society, themselves happy and fulfilled. And we want that for our children and for our neighbors and our friends and our family. And we can't imagine that anybody else might think different. Turns out that they do. Now, I want to qualify what I'm saying, and it's very important, that we're talking about the radical jihadists that are not all Muslims. Not all Muslims are in this radical Islamist jihadi mindset. The numbers in the research talk about 25, maybe 30%. Okay, so the majority of Muslims are not ascribing to this ideology. Most of the Muslims that I know, that are my neighbors and colleagues, are wonderful, kind people. But 30% of 1.5 billion is still a lot of people. Okay, so that's something that we have to keep in mind. Why am I mentioning this? Because we're talking about now the Middle East is shifting from a Shia axis to a Sunni axis. It's the same ideology. It's a jihadi ideology. So we have to be very, very wary and careful and have our vigilance to keep exploring what's happening around us, because the enemy of our enemy is not always our friend. Okay, he might be eventually, but that's not an assumption that we can make. This is not me saying this, this is their words, right? So if you want to look at the Hamas charter, and everybody's been talking about Hamas and Gaza, but I want to zoom out again to the regional context. Turkey, which is behind the insurrection in Syria, Erdogan himself is part of the Islamic Brotherhood. So the Islamic Brotherhood is Hamas. When the civil war in Syria broke out, and these same guys were challenging Assad and his regime, Hamas was waving their flag. Okay, so we're talking about shades of black, we're talking about maybe new rhetoric, but the underlying ideology is still there, and we have to be wary of this. As we move forward, I want to again go back to the original idea of how Israelis viewed the situation. The magnitude of October 7th was so great that it changed the way Israelis understand the conflict. And this is how we have to understand Israelis' actions today also, Israel's policy. We're no longer fighting a war of post-1967. That is, we're not engaged in some kind of a land for peace or an argument about where the border shall be. This is not about where the border shall be. This is whether there will even be a border. Israelis woke up in the morning of October 7th to understand that we're still fighting the war of 1948. We're still fighting a war of existence. That is one of the things that has changed in Israeli society and Israeli policymaking, which have not gone back to October 6th. Now, last year I stood here and I told you that everything that happened before October 6th, including the internal Israeli division, will not come back. I was wrong. Israeli society is as divided as ever. Israeli internal politics are as divided as ever. The polarization within Israeli society is as great as ever. And these are challenges that Israeli society and Israeli political system must also deal with. I want you to take a picture of this screen, but I want you also to then put them in your hidden folder of the hidden photos and never open these websites. There are already people, they're already denying it the next day. They're denying that these things ever happened. And we have to keep them in mind, because when you one day meet somebody that says that never happened or was a false flag Israeli operation, you will sit them down, open one of these websites and watch them. Watch it. This documentation is, again, part of the mindset of creating fear and terrorism in your enemy. And the hostages are still very, very much in our mind. There are 100 hostages that are still being held in Gaza. There are talks now about their release. There are talks now about some window of opportunity. How did this come about? Probably because Hamas, for the first time since the beginning of the war, feels absolutely alone. By taking out Hezbollah from the equation, we have managed to completely isolate Hamas from its former allies. One of the great achievements of the front in Lebanon is de-linking the northern front from the southern front, which is what Nasrallah said will never happen. Okay? He also thought he'll never have a bunker fall on top of his head while watching Netanyahu give a speech in Congress, which I think is very ironic. But his whole idea of linking the fronts and creating this ring of fire around Israel has completely collapsed. Hamas, feeling entirely alone, entirely without backing, entirely without options, are now willing to deal more, and hopefully we'll have a hostage deal, and we'll see some of them released in the next few weeks. These are the changes that we saw in Palestinian opinions after October 7th. Now, again, this is one of the things that have changed in Israel. These polls show that the support for Hamas in the West Bank increased after October 7th, months after October 7th. Even in Gaza, a little bit. That there is still an understanding that Hamas did the right thing in beginning the war on October 7th. What Israelis understand today that we didn't understand a year ago is that this ideology is not a separate ideology from Palestinian population, but is a legitimate expression of Palestinian belief systems. Okay, and a lot of times you hear a lot of politicians and diplomats from around the world who are talking about Hamas as a bad thing. Hamas bad, terrorists bad, legitimate Palestinian aspirations good. All right, we have to and are separating these things. What we understand today is that there's no separation. It's a legitimate expression. That's something that we have to take into consideration moving forward. The regional impact a year later has also been completely changed. A year ago, I showed you the slide and I talked about Iran's ring of fire, how it built for 40 years proxy armies surrounding Israel with the goal and the intent to destroy Israel, not as a goal in and of itself, but as a stepping stone, as a springboard to go west. This was their deterrence against Israel from attacking its own nuclear program. That too has been completely dismantled. Look where Syria is. And going west now is no longer an option for Iran. On April 13th, 24, we saw what it looked like with the attack of these 300 cruise missiles and drones that were fired into Israel. Pretty much all of them were shot down with the help of our neighbors and allies. Israel's response, both for this attack and the next attack that came in September, was that Iran was completely stripped of its air defenses. Iran today is basically lays bare, defenseless from any Israeli attack, which is why it is so careful from anything. You see that it dialed down its rhetoric, it's changing its whole tone, and that's a very good thing from our perspective. So the ring of fire has been broken, and there's no longer a deterrence for Israel to take out Hamas targets. We talked a little bit about the global ramifications. And what we're seeing now is a continuation of this as we're zooming out. We're understanding now that the war between Israel and Hamas is not the war between Israel and Hamas. My friend and colleague, Matty Friedman, likes to always ask the question of the audience, have you ever heard of he's Canadian, of the Canada-Italy War of 1940? Anybody ever hear of the Canada-Italy War of 1940? There were Canadian troops fighting Italian fascists in Italy in 1940. How come you've never heard about this war? Well, obviously, because it was part of a much larger conflict. And that's the larger conflict that we are looking at. The war between Israel and Hamas, the war between Israel and Hezbollah, is not the war between Israel, Hamas, Israel, Hezbollah. At the very least, it's a war between Israel and Iran. But I will argue that what Israel is to Iran, Ukraine is to Russia, Taiwan is to China, Japan and South Korea are to North Korea. And we can expand these camps even further. I would argue that we're witnessing a clash of civilizations. We're witnessing the new global chessboard. And when people ask me, Uri, why are you going around talking to Americans about this? Why should they even care? My answer is because Well, first of all, a lot of people care about Israel, and that's very important. But also because it's not just about Israel. It's about our entire way of life. It's about the people who support the countries, the nations that support the idea of life and liberties and freedoms, the Judeo-Christian value system, and the other countries that are in that camp. They're moderate Arab countries that aspire to that way of life too. And on the other side are the despots, the tyrants, the dictators that support jihadism, subjugation of women and minorities, religious minorities, gender minorities. In what world will our children and grandchildren grow up? The result, I'll say differently, the extent to which Israel will be able to win this war will have effect on Western civilization for years to come. I want to move forward a little bit and tell you a little bit about where we are. Does this work? I'm going to turn this on. No? Can we turn this on? Okay, I'll use my big voice. So why don't you look, this is the Gaza Strip. This is the Gaza Strip, and what you see here in orange is where the Israeli forces are currently. Where you see in yellow is where the Israeli forces have operated over the last year, then pulled out. The areas without color are areas that Israel has not operated, and this is where mostly what we call today the humanitarian zones. Okay, this is where the more than 2 million strong population of Gaza has been concentrated in these areas. Okay, so what Israel is now doing in Gaza is surrounding the Gaza Strip with sort of a security zone, as well as capturing the center, or the third of it. This is the Netzarim corridor, in a very wide, it's almost 5-6 kilometers wide, of an area which is completely under Israeli control. Israel is building infrastructure, military infrastructure in there, roads and antennas and military positions that are not temporary. They're not temporary. Israel is also widening the corridor here, this Metasim corridor, again connecting the border of Israel with the beach, and slowly widening. The towns of Bet Hanun, Bet Lahia, Jabalia refugee camp, Sajaiya, these are all areas that are still have heavy presence of Hamas. What Israel is trying to do is move the civilian population to the humanitarian area to make a Hamas-free zone. Once making a Hamas-free zone, they can start rebuilding without Hamas. Now, it's not going to happen overnight. By the way, I should also say, I'm not a representative of the government of Israel. This is not an official plan that anybody has announced. It's what I gather from the information that's available, and especially the information that's not. For many, many months, Israel has been trying to find that alternative to Hamas ruling in Gaza. One of the reasons that this has been so difficult is because Hamas is still functioning not so much as a military force, although that exists. And the death of 3 Israeli soldiers in the last 24 hours in Gaza is proof of that. It still exists, but mostly they are still the sole organization that can take control of the aid and the food and the distribution of that in the Gaza Strip. And so, okay. But you can hear me in the back, right? Yeah. So as long as Hamas continues to be in charge of distributing all the aid that goes into the Gaza Strip, there's no alternative to Hamas. They will continue to rule. For Israel to end the war with Hamas still able to control population means that it can rebuild its military force as well, that means that the last 14 months have been for naught. It's been a complete waste of time. There's no ability to end, Israel has no intention to end the war in Gaza with Hamas still intact. And they were looking for local tribes and family leaders and local village leaders. They were turning to the Egyptians, they were turning to the Saudis and the UAE, or a combination of them. There's nobody. No one. UNRWA is not an option. Like UNRWA is Hamas. UNRWA is a terrorist supporting organization with the help of the UN. And so what Israel's left is the least, it's a terrible option, but it's the least worst option existing right now, is to do it ourselves. But to do that, we first have to clear this area of Hamas completely. It starts by clearing the civilian population so we can root out Hamas properly.
Yeah, that one's.
And then allow people to return and start rebuilding the Hamas-free zone. Okay, there we go. So that's what we're looking at in Gaza. It's not going to end tomorrow. It's not going to end in a month. It's going to take many months, even years, for this to occur. So if anybody's expecting some kind of a magic wand and for Israel to redeploy on the international border, that's not going to happen. So that's what we're looking at in Gaza. Rafah also, this is the area in Rafah in red you see is where Israel has already mostly demolished and captured. That's terror infrastructure. It's actually bigger than that today. These are the areas in Lebanon that Israel has entered. Now you can see that these villages, you have the first row of villages over here. Pretty much all of these villages are Hamas bases. They look like a civilian village, but they're not. I mean, there are civilians that live there, but every house is a weapons cache. Underground are bunkers and tunnels and huge caches of weapons and vehicles and rockets and explosives, all ready for that day that they would be called in to carry out a 7th of October-like attack in the north of Israel. The difference is that Hezbollah was 10 times stronger than Hamas. So again, in a sense, we got very lucky that Hamas pulled the trigger before Hezbollah did. Okay, but the result is that Hezbollah began to fire rockets into Israel, but they didn't carry a ground attack. A year into it, Israel carried out the ground attack. It started with the beeper walkie-talkie operation, and then right away an incursion. But of course, Hezbollah is all over Lebanon, so that included also air raids in Beirut itself and everywhere else. This is the point I want you to remember. This is the Litani River. Now, the understandings, though, what we call the ceasefire that has been reached, requires Hezbollah to remain north of the Litani River. And Hezbollah's movement south of the Litani River is considered a breach of the ceasefire. France has accused Israel of breaching the ceasefire 50-something times, something like that. It's actually the opposite. Again, these are one of the things that Israel will not return to. Until October 6th, we had ceasefires. We had ceasefire in Gaza, we had ceasefire in Lebanon, and that meant that you stopped shooting. But that didn't stop Hamas and Hezbollah from rebuilding their terror infrastructure and rearming themselves. This time, Israel says, that's not going to happen. Yes, there's no more shooting, but we are going to enforce the understanding that Hezbollah doesn't show up again south of the Litani. The UN was supposed to do it back in 2006. Remember Resolution 1701? But they apparently, well, turns out that they're really, UNIFIL, I used to say that UNIFIL is worthless, but then I saw the UN budget for UNIFIL. So they're actually really expensive. They're not worthless at all. They're about $500 million worth a year. That's the UN budget for UNIFIL in Lebanon for not doing its job. Okay, so now Israel is saying no. So when you see here, Israel has attacked targets in Lebanon, and the French get all up in arms that are claiming Israel has violated ceasefire, it's the other way around. Israel is enforcing the ceasefire by preventing Hezbollah to once again take over the south. That's where we are. In Lebanon, we have 60 days. We're already a month into it, or 3 weeks into it. Again, it's not without casualties. Yesterday, 4 Israeli soldiers, reservists, were killed in Lebanon. It happens to be also from my unit, 9263. It's a paratrooper reserve unit, and they were killed in a tunnel, in a Hezbollah tunnel, before it blew up. This is a security zone in Lebanon where Israel told people not to return yet until the Lebanese army can deploy in the south. Right? The Lebanese army has yet to deploy in the south. Okay, but they're supposed to deploy, and if they don't, Israel will remain there. The destruction on the border, you can see here, the village over here of Mesajbel. Right here, this is the border. This is Kibbutz Manara. Kibbutz Manara doesn't exist anymore, by the way. Kibbutz Manara has been targeted by Hezbollah. Every house has been blown up. Pretty much the entire kibbutz has been destroyed. But then we took out the whole village next to it. Okay, with explosives, because each one of these houses was a terror base going into Israel, or had a tunnel underneath it. This is what it looks like. Yeah, that's Al-Mantura. It's a different village, but that's essentially what these operations look like. Tunnels going in and out of Lebanon. Also, I want to show you, this is the last day of before the ceasefire, a facility, a rocket and a drone building facility underground that Hezbollah thought that we didn't know about, but it was taken out just the night before the ceasefire went into effect. It's almost 1.5 kilometers long. It's 1.4 kilometers long, just shy of a mile. Major construction facilities underground. You can see also the chimneys to air out the fumes, with an entry point on the Syrian side and an entry point on the Lebanese side.
Ask a question.
Yes.
Who's actually building these? Who's building these?
Iran is funding it, or was funding it. North Korea is heavily involved in the digging and the construction. And Hezbollah, they're a very big employer. There are many tens of thousands of Shiites in Lebanon, and this is part of their employment opportunities. But those are the sources: Iran, North Korea, and Hezbollah. You can see it's 1.4 kilometers long, 70 kilometers wide, and 80 meters underground. That's how far the bunker busters had to go in order to get to that facility. So we talked about the ring of fire, which has been completely broken. This is Syria. This is Syria before the rebels began their incursion. Again, the day of the ceasefire began in Lebanon, then the rebels. Now you can imagine this is not something that they just woke up that morning to decide to do. They've been planning this for a long time, and it's coordinated by Turkey. Turkey is the mastermind behind this whole area. Many millions of Sunni refugees that are in the area over here of Idlib and Turkey, and there are two major thrusts of the rebels. One, the Free Syrian Army, which are relatively secular, and they were charged by the Turks to push the Kurds back. Turkey has 3 interests. 1, to empty its territory from Syrian refugees. 2, to push back the Kurds and prevent them from uniting with the Kurds in Turkey. And 3, and maybe most importantly, recreate the Ottoman Empire. Erdogan, again, Erdogan is Islamic Brotherhood. Okay, he's part of the Islamic Brotherhood. His ideology is Islamic Brotherhood. He's an Islamist, and he wants to rebuild the Ottoman Empire. He wants to exert influence in the entire region, become the next Khalif of this Muslim caliphate. And he's now on the border of Israel. Okay, so this is something that we have to also remember. The third rebel force is the American-backed rebels. All right, so you have the jihadists, this Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, this guy Jawlani. This is a conglomerate of jihadists from ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Jabhat Nusra, and many others that come together. And they're the ones that mostly headed down this way, the Free Syrian Army towards the Kurds. And you have the American-backed rebels coming from the south, all converging on Damascus. I'm going to stop here because let's see if I can get to the other. Hold on. I'll stop this and I'll get to here. And I want to leave you time for questions because that's what I was supposed to do. These are you can see that Israel centered its attacks in Beirut. I want you to see how, okay. We're back to, so Syria, you can see here the movement of all the rebels. And this is the move. Sorry, I'm trying to go backwards there. This is the movement of the rebels. And this happened in a span of less than 2 weeks. Now, I want you to notice how they're first going south. Okay, the white is the jihadi rebels. Okay, up here, the green are the Free Syrian Army vis-a-vis the Kurds. They're going to slowly push them back. This area is Russian. Okay, Latakia, Tartus. This is the Russian-controlled area. They stayed out of it. The rebels have a lot of weaponry and drones and know-how from the Ukrainians as well. So Turkey and Ukraine are working here together. And once they got Aleppo, then they got Homs, then they got Hama, and they're heading towards Damascus. Look at the American-backed rebels who are slowly making their way to Pelirma. Remember, everybody remembers Pelirma from the days of ISIS. And the Kurds are redeploying on the east side of the Euphrates. And that's it. What Israel has done. Israel, once the Assad regime has fallen, the agreements of 1974 are essentially over. Now, who remembers Henry Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy? There we go. Henry Kissinger, 1973, after the Yom Kippur War, comes to the region, goes back and forth between Damascus and Jerusalem, comes up with an idea of a DMZ, a demilitarized zone, and a disengagement agreement between Israel and Syria. It's signed in 1974. That agreement stipulates that there will be an area between Israel and Syria, which will be demilitarized. Now, there are villages here. They are Syrian, this is Syrian sovereign territory. And this is called the Alpha Line and the Bravo Line. But no Syrian troops are allowed here. Okay, that's been the UN organization called UNDOF, United Nations Disengagement and Observation Force, which is supposed to oversee this. Relatively effective until the civil war. But once Assad fell, that entire agreement is now out the window because it was signed with the Assad regime. His father first and then him. And so Israel has now taken over the DMZ, and Israel moved its forces into the DMZ and even further in the Quneitra. By the way, the area where the civil war began is down here. Okay, this is where the civil war actually began. Israel has moved in and taken over some of the positions over here and even doing more actions in here. And most importantly, the Hermon. Israel has now moved for the first time since 1973 to the high part of the Hermon mountain, 600 meters further up. to the Syrian side of the Hermon. Now we have eyes and ears of Damascus, even more than we had before. Again, the enemy of our enemy is not our friend. This Jolani, who again has a very distinguished jihadi pedigree, is saying all the right things. He's talking about Syria, which will be a peaceful country that will treat its all minorities fairly, and he invites people to come back. And he doesn't have any aspirations outside of Syria, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe he's genuine, but we don't know that yet. So his actions will determine how this will unfold. And even if he himself is a reformed jihadist, there's still plenty of the people in the Toyota trucks behind him who have been carrying out beheadings and ISIS-like atrocities along the path of the jihadists. So Israel has now taken up those assets. And in the last 48 hours, and this is something I just updated this morning, in blue, you see, this is the last 48 hours. Israel has carried out more than 150 attacks in Syria, taking out Syrian army, Assad army, weapons caches, heavy armaments, tanks, depots, missile defense systems. Anything that can be used against Israel is now being completely taken off the table. Right? So we'll be removing any chance that they will be able to take over these weapon systems and use them strategically against Israel. That's where we are as we speak right now. And with that, I'm going to end this this introduction that was supposed to be only 15 minutes long. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Uri. That was really interesting. I don't think any of us would have minded if you just kept on going. But there was one slide that popped up briefly that I did want to ask about, and we get questions about quite a bit. The slide that popped up was the big three lies about Israel. And there's the war going on in the Middle East, of course, and there's also a PR propaganda war going on in the United States on college campuses and in the media and other places. And that's the one that we get questioned about quite a bit. And it's how do we push back on some of the lies that are told about Israel? What kind of resources are there that people can refer to stand up for what they know to be true, but maybe can't really express because they don't have the depth of knowledge that you necessarily do?
So that's a very good question. So first of all, people talking about the 7-war, 8-war front, you should always add another one for this PR war. Say that Israel's winning the war of the battlefield and loses the battle of diplomacy. It's very important to stand up and speak out when these statements are made, because when they're made often, for example, Israel is committing a genocide. And that's repeated so often in the media that it's almost become like an axiom. So the ICC joins in, and then the ICJ joins in, and then there's a warrant against it, and people who are not involved think, oh, it makes sense because it's a genocide. So of course, but we have to stand up and say no. So I have I call them the big three: genocide, apartheid, colonialism. The first thing to understand about combating these lies is that they are founded in lies themselves. Like they are completely, they're built on a foundation of misconceptions and lies about Israel. Why this is happening is also important to understand. The more Israel can be vilified, the more Israel can be delegitimized, then you're undermining the intellectual underpinnings of its existence. Now you can start talking about its legitimacy. Does Israel have a right to exist? No other country in the world has this question asked about it. So if you're challenging Israel's right to exist, you must do so on the basis of its being the most horrible country in the world. Anti-Semitism is often defined as in every society and in every age and in every generation, the opposite of whatever society holds dear. Whatever the highest value of a given society, the Jew will be the opposite. If you're a capitalist, the Jew is the communist. In communism, the Jew is a capitalist. In a time of religion, the Jew is the Antichrist. In a time of national growth and national nation states, the Jew is the usurper, the traitor. In a time of racial purity, the Jew is the ultimate impurity. Right, so it's always the opposite of whatever society holds dear. Today, in this day and age, human rights is the biggest, the highest social value, social justice. The biggest crime is colonialism, right? And so it's not politically correct to say the Jews, so you say the Zionist. It's became a placeholder for the Jews. And so you have this whole thrust to delegitimize Israel using these same tropes. When it comes to genocide, it's pretty easy. It's pretty easy if you're able to sit with somebody down. But before that, let me also try to warn you. You will never bring somebody from their certainty to your certainty. That's just not going to happen. A lot of the people that are, and again, they're not all cut from the same cloth. They're the actual pro-Hamas, pro-terrorists, people that think that October 7th was wonderful and resistance by any means, and that raping Jewish women is okay because it's for resistance. There's no common ground there. Like, these are jihadists. There's nothing to talk about. And then there which I think are the majority of this crowd, which are not the majority of the total crowd, they're just the majority of this crowd, which are people who are following along because it's the progressive thing to do, or because it's the fashion of the time, or because they buy into the idea of social justice and standing in solidarity and intersectionality and all the issues that are now very, very popular on college campuses. And in the past, the same people would have been the ones that were waving all the right flags. This what we call luxury opinions. It's like, right? They have luxury opinions because, it's fun to have. It says more. It's like virtue signaling or whatever it is that you want to call it. It's opinions that they have because it puts them in the right circle in society, but they don't actually know. The little shot from the river to the sea, because it sounds cool and freedom and liberty, but they don't know which river and which sea. And so these are the people that we can talk to. And again, you won't bring them from their certainty to yours, but you can start asking them questions to start casting doubt. You can bring them to doubt. You can bring them to question some of these axioms. And one of them, for example, is, what is genocide? What is the definition of genocide? How do you, okay, you throw that out. A lot of Palestinians are being killed in Gaza. Does that constitute genocide, or is that just a tragic result of war? Genocide has to do with the intent to destroy an entire people or race or ethnicity. And the numbers just don't add up. I'll show you an example because I happen to have it right here. By the way, if you go to my website, traveltrailerisrael.com, there's a section there called resources, and then you'll find how to talk about the conflict, where I have papers on genocide, apartheid, colonialism, anti-Semitism, West Bank, international law. You can find a lot of resources over there, but I want to show you, let's see if I can find it quickly. There. Let's go here. So this is what genocide looks like. This is what genocide looks like on a graph. I did this in about 1.5 minutes with ChatGPT. Okay, it's really easy. You just I think it was Claude, not ChatGPT. Never mind. But you can see here again that this is what genocide looks like in numbers. Now, if Israel's committing a genocide in Gaza, we should have a similar graph. But this is what the population growth of the Palestinian population looks like. Now notice that point in the middle. This is 1967. Why did I put 1967 on the graph? This is the point where the Palestinian Arabs, or the Arabs that are now called Palestinian in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, came under Israeli control. And you can see that the trajectory changes for the better. This is not what genocide looks like. All right, if Israel is intending to carry out a genocide in Gaza, then we really suck at it. Like, honestly, you can think that the Jews would come up with a better plan. So the numbers don't add up. So what is it then? It's not a genocide. And again, the questions, do you know what a genocide is? Can you define a genocide for me? Let's look together at what this looks like, what real genocides look like, and what the Palestinian growth looks like. So then how do you explain so many people being killed in Gaza? Let's get into that too. First of all, the numbers. How do we know that 40,000 people were killed in Gaza? There are no independent journalists in Gaza. They're all Al Jazeera or independent journalists who are, many of whom taking marching orders from Hamas, but they're feeding AP and New York Times and all the other news agencies. But let's go with that number 40, let's say it's 45,000 now. Let's go with that number and assume it's correct. Israel is saying that the IDF has claimed that it's already killed roughly 20,000 terrorists in its battles in the Gaza Strip. Now, Hamas doesn't differentiate, the Palestinian health authorities in Gaza don't differentiate between combatants and non-combatants in their casualty count. They also don't tell you how many people had natural deaths. In a population of 2.5 million, that's several hundred every month. They also don't tell you how many people were killed by errant missiles that Hamas and Islamic Jihad fired themselves, or how many people were killed by Hamas who are going around shooting people from trying to get aid. Okay, but let's put that aside. Israel has killed 20,000 terrorists. That's about half of the number of the total casualties. Which is terrible. 20,000 civilians who are killed in war is a horrible, and I don't want to minimize even a single civilian death. Okay, let's not minimize this. It's a tragedy for them, for their families, and for their loved ones. Do you know what the global average of combatant to non-combatant casualties are in urban warfare? Anybody know? The UN publishes this. I'm not making this up. It's 9-1. Right? Out of 10 casualties in wars around the world, 9 are civilian, 1 is a combatant. Okay? In Iraq and Afghanistan, the American and the British forces were able to achieve 1-4 or 1-5. And here Israel's doing 1-1, or 1-1.5 if you want to go to the extreme. Not only is Israel not committing a genocide, not only is Israel not acting in disproportionate power, Israel is raising the standard, raising the bar in protecting civilian lives in urban combat in greater way than any other combat and any other army in the world. Those are the numbers. Those numbers are never reported. There will never be a newscaster or any media outlet that will sit down and talk about the casualties coming out of Gaza, the casualty count, the daily casualty count coming out of Gaza, and talk about the ratio. It does not fit the narrative. By the way, anybody know how many people were killed in the last 2 weeks in Syria? Suddenly, there's silence. Nobody knows. It's a mystery. It's a fog of war. We don't actually know. Well, there's only one battle, one conflict around the world today that everybody knows exactly every day how many people are killed, and that's in Gaza, and that is also flawed. Still, fine, Uri, great. But 40,000 people, that's a lot of people. And all these news casters, it's the worst. Heard somebody on CNN saying, it's the worst conflict that I've ever witnessed. I was in Cambodia in the 1960s. This is worse than that. And Cristiano Ampur nodded her head. Really? Only in the last 10 years alone, this is the conflict in Gaza. Yemen, Sudan, Syria. The numbers are staggeringly higher. Staggeringly higher. So now do I ask, is Israel committing a genocide? Is this the worst conflict ever? The answer to both those questions are no. Still tragic, casualties of war, not genocide. Yes, sir.
Kurds and the Americans who do the nuclear schedule.
That'll have to be our last question.
Oh, okay.
That's fine.
So that's a very good question. But we have to understand that Syria, like Lebanon, are not countries. To understand this properly, we have to understand that these are not countries. They're arenas where different forces play. Okay, they're not nation states the way we imagine nation states. Okay, it's true in Lebanon. It's now true also in Syria. And the Kurds, for those of you who don't know, in the northeast part of Syria, a large Kurdish minority. There's a large Kurdish minority in northern Iraq, Iran, and Turkey. 40 million Kurds in total. They're the victims of Sykes-Picot, 1917. They never got their own state. Okay, now they're divided between 4 states. Is this part of this question? Okay, so let me just finish this, and then if you have time, we can move on. I'll happy to stay, by the way, if you have more questions and everybody has to go. Israel has found in the Kurds allies. They're also been the most effective fighting force against ISIS, and they're also backed by the Americans. For Turkey, there are a complete red line. For Turkey, Kurdish independence destabilized Turkey. Turkey itself is 1/3 Kurdish. And the Kurdish organization, the PKK, are considered a terror organization. They're recognized as a terror group worldwide. But they have sister organizations in Syria, in the Syrian Kurdish areas. So from the Turkish perspective, to push back the Kurds as much as possible is one of the main goals of this war. One of the mistakes that Israel believes occurred after the destruction of ISIS is that then the Kurds weren't allowed to take over that area to establish an autonomy or a state, A, to make sure ISIS doesn't return, and B, to sever the land connection between Iran and Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon through Syria. That didn't happen, and it wasn't the right time. And so they remained in sort of like this autonomous area. And right now, they're being hammered. Israel has sent messages through its different channels to the Syrians to lay off the Kurds. The Americans have sent those messages. It's not clear how this will play out. President-elect Trump already announced that this is not our fight. We're staying out of this. I hate to say it, but you're already in it. They're American troops on the ground. They're American allies on the ground. America can't afford another pullout style Afghanistan and actually reestablish its power in the region. I would hope, and this is just me, Uri, speaking, I would hope that both the Americans would support the Kurds to hold their line and not be completely demolished. I think that the Kurds are one of the stabilizing groups in the region. Having said that, Israel has very limited leverage over the new Syria. So we don't know exactly what's going to happen. But several different Israeli politicians have already announced that we are watching out for the Kurds and we support the Kurds in their effort for independence.
Can we give Uri a nice round of applause, please? In his last presentation, he gave us a great historical perspective of this whole conflict. And Charles and I have tried to capture the important parts and done it to several professional groups. If any of you would like us to show up, we would be happy to do that. If you have a group you'd like us to talk to about this same type of area, we never do as well as he does, but we've tried to learn and be good students. I don't think there's anybody here who probably doesn't know about our organization, but Iowans Supporting Israel is a bipartisan charitable organization. It's made up of Republicans and Democrats. It's bipartisan because it has to be. And I just want to remind you that December 31st is approaching. And if any of you would like to take down your tax liabilities, we would welcome your donations. We continue to move this thing statewide with the help of Ambassador Branstad and Attorney General Miller. Charles is headed to Davenport, the Quad Cities tonight to help perpetuate the statewide presence. He's done an excellent job of helping to promote that on a statewide basis as well. So if any of you would like to talk to Uri, we'd encourage you to stick around and talk. We're not trying to stop it off, but we try to keep it to an hour so that folks can get back to work or whatever they have to do.